honourable member for Guelph is rising on the same point.
Yes, sir. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of my colleague from Scarborough-Guildwood on his question of privilege. When using the three criteria cited by my colleague for holding a member of this House in contempt, you will find, I believe, sufficient evidence to indicate that the Minister for International Cooperation, who is responsible for CIDA and its funding decisions, is in fact in contempt of Parliament, and that her statements were misleading, that she knew at the time that they were misleading, and that her statements were intended to mislead the House. And for clarification, I propose to you that the Minister did make a statement, if not more than one, misleading to the House. It is my proposition that if a member of this House offers a statement that is misleading and knows it to be misleading, the only conclusion at which the Speaker can arrive is that the statement was intended to be misleading. It is clear when checking the Minister's statements against information obtained at the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee meetings that the statements made by the Minister were misleading and intended to be so. By way of evidence, I will now cite the debate the Minister and I engaged in question period on October 28, 2010, in which I asked, quote, Mr. Speaker, we have now learned from CIDA documents obtained through access to information and reviewed by the Minister 1 year ago that KAIROS objectives are in fact, quote, strategically aligned with our country program objectives, end quote. The question continued. On September 20 of this year, the Minister for CIDA, in absolute contradiction of her own department's findings, said, quote, KAIROS was recently refused funding as it did not meet the government's priorities, end quote. Now that we know the Minister's pretext for the KAIROS cuts is false, will the Minister now finally restore funding to this organization? End of question. In her response to my question on October 28, 2010, the Minister said, quote, after due diligence, it was determined that KAIROS' proposal did not meet government's standards, end quote. Remember now, on September 20, she said, quote, KAIROS was recently refused funding as it did not meet the government's priorities. But then she has made this statement now at least twice. Mr. Speaker, we now know both of these statements to be false. Why? Because Margaret Biggs, CIDA's president, and Naresh Singh, the vice president for CIDA, said so on December 9, 2010 at the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee meeting. They testified that they positively endorsed the funding application for KAIROS. In fact, Mr. Speaker, CIDA staff found that the bid met their criteria, received a positive audit report, and had an excellent evaluation. And accordingly, CIDA staff sent their response for approval to the Minister. The application approval was endorsed by CIDA's president and vice president as follows, quote, that you sign below to indicate you approve a contribution of $7,098,758 over 4 years for the above program, end quote. CIDA wanted to fund KAIROS. After departmental deliberation, the President decided that funding KAIROS was the right thing to do. So it's clear to me that the department's standards were met and that it fit departmental priorities. This is particularly disappointing when we review an order paper question submitted by the member from London North Centre, which asked, quote, with regard to KAIROS, which has lost their funding from the Canadian International Development Agency as of November 30, 2009, due to KAIROS no longer fitting CIDA priorities, A, what are the CIDA priorities that did not fit well with the priorities of KAIROS? B, what sort of criteria does CIDA examine to determine whether or not a non-governmental organization will receive funding, end quote. In response, the Minister offered the following, quote, Mr. Speaker, with regard to A, the CIDA decision not to continue funding KAIROS was based on the overall assessment of the proposal, not any single criterion, end quote. The operative words here are, quote, the CIDA decision not to continue funding KAIROS, end quote. CIDA's decision was to continue funding KAIROS, not to discontinue its funding. The Minister is clearly continuing with her subterfuge. The Minister's statement is in complete contradiction to CIDA's position that it met the funding criteria, and for the minister to state otherwise is misleading. The response to question B is as follows. Non-government organization proposals to CIDA are assessed on a variety of criteria which are described on CIDA's website. Further, any distinction the minister may try to create or imply between CIDA's criteria and the government's criteria, if she attempts to make such a distinction, are irrelevant. To find otherwise would bring into disrepute all government websites, because people will no longer be able to rely upon government websites as reflecting the priorities of the government. The fact that the minister may have used the words, quote, government standards, end quote, or, quote, government priorities in the House, as opposed to CIDA priorities, is therefore irrelevant, because CIDA priorities represent the government's priorities, and its criteria are the government's criteria. Mr. Speaker, did the minister at the time know that her statement was incorrect? On December 9, 2010, at the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee meeting, Ms. Biggs made clear that the minister was aware of her department's position. She said, quote, my discussions with the minister were quite clear. She did, as she indicated, deliberate on it. She knew what my advice was, so she was not misled in any way, end quote. This statement by Ms. Biggs must be considered in addition to the fact that KAIROS received a positive audit report and an excellent evaluation, and that it was recommended for funding by CIDA's President and Vice President, all of which facts had to have been known to the minister. Did she intend to mislead the House? Mr. Speaker, unless a statement is made negligently, with no regard for the facts whatsoever, or with no regard to the nature of the question asked whatsoever, or misleading information is given to you by your department before offering an answer, which is clearly not the case here, then one can only conclude that the answer given is intended to mislead the House. The definition of mislead, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is to, and I quote, cause someone to have a wrong idea or impression. Anything stated designed to or with the intention of misleading the House, knowing it to be false, imports the conclusion that the person making this statement intended it to mislead or had no regard for whether it would mislead or not, which is equally contemptuous. In closing, my colleague from Scarborough-Guildwood's remarks, as well as the information that I have presented to you, make clear that the minister did, in fact, mislead this House. The statements made by Ms. Biggs in committee make clear that the minister was aware that she was incorrect in making the statement she made, and I therefore submit that the minister intended to mislead this House and its members. The minister said that KAIROS funding was cut because CIDA did not want to fund it, or that it did not meet government priorities and standards. We know this to be false. We also have demonstrated that the nuance between whether it met government priorities or standards or CIDA priorities is irrelevant, as CIDA priorities must be government priorities. How can they be anything less? And if they are, then this government and not Parliament is truly dysfunctional. We know now the minister's statements to be false, and we also know that the minister was aware that it was false while she was offering her justifications to the numerous questions asked of her in question period. As such, I strongly believe that this provides sufficient evidence to hold the minister in contempt of this House. If the minister did not want to fund KAIROS, then she should have explained why she did not want to provide funding, instead of pinning the decision on the department she runs. And I, for one, would still like an honest answer. And I think everyone in this House and in Canada has the right to know why KAIROS was not funded. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.